Hello class. In this tutorial I'm going to go through utilizing splines in order to model a table. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into Photoshop and I need to set up my reference. I already found an image from online. I've opened it up inside of Photoshop and I've turned on my rulers. You can go view rulers to turn them on. It turns on these ruler increments up here and over on the side. So if you click on the ruler and drag down, that'll drop a guideline in. You can see that my table is crooked, so I want to have this straight for my reference. So I'm going to go ahead and clone this layer by dragging it down here to the new page or new layer, and then I'm going to do edit, free transform, and now I'm going to rotate this so that the table lines up with the reference. It's straight up and down. There we go. I'm going to hit enter, and that'll commit the transform that I just did. I drag a line over here. All right, well, it's looking pretty good. Now this table is made up of this upper portion here, the main table. You have the pedestal coming down, and then it has these individual legs. You can see the arrangement for the legs over here on the side. So what I'm going to do now is, now that I've rotated it, I'm going to come over to the side, and I just want to flatten my image. Go ahead and use my eyedropper to select the color, and then I'm going to come down to the corner and switch foreground to background. And I just want to take my canvas here, change this to pixels, and I'm going to square it off. So it does put a little bit of dead space at the top and bottom, but it's going to make it easier for me to set up my reference image. So now I'm going to go ahead and save this. We'll do File, Save. I'm going to say this is the highest possible. And I just went and saved it because I already had opened up, I had already copied the reference into a specific folder. So now here in the front, I'm going to go ahead and make a plane. And once I've created the plane, I'm going to go to Modify and square off the values. And remove length and width to 1. And I'm just hitting Tab to go between the different portions. I'm going to come up to Move now, and I'm going to center my reference plane. Alright, next I come into the Material Editor. I bring over a standard material, and from my reference, I'm just going to drag in my table reference. This, I drag the node, I plug it into Diffuse, and now I right click and assign material to selection. I'm able to assign it because I actually have the model selected. And I right click once again and say Show Realistic Material in Viewport. So now if I make the front view shaded, you can see there's my table. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag this up so that the table, when we finish, it'll be sitting at 0. And I'm going to drag it back a little bit. There we go. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to turn off the grid, which if you come up here and click on the little plus sign on the side, grid's an option. You can also use G as a shortcut. Alright, so next I'm going to come in here and I want to go Object Properties. I'm going to do Backface Cull. I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to turn off Show Frozen to Gray so I can freeze my reference. And now I'm just going to take this, I'm going to clone it. Edit, Clone as an instance. I'm going to move it over, and I'm going to rotate it. I'm going to turn on my angle snap. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. There we go. So now here in perspective, I'm going to switch my view to shaded. For me, it would be default shading in later versions of Max. Alright, so I'm just going to move this over, and I want to line up where the pedestal portion is between these two different versions here. And kind of get them generally close together. Let's pull that out to get to the center of it. There we go. So it's about even there, left to right, so that's good. And now if I make a top view, I'm going to make this shaded. I can move this guy out. And the reason I'm doing this is that when we get to the point where we're lining up the table legs, the individual table legs on the bottom. This way we can kind of look at and make sure that they line up properly. So I'm going to want this centered on the X-plane here. That's about right. Now I'm actually going to select both of them and turn my grid back on by hitting G. And I'm going to just slide this over so that I want the table centered on 0. So I'm going to, real quick, I'm going to come up here to Snaps Toggle. I'm going to right click and bring up my grid and snap settings. And on the home grid, I'm going to change that to 100 and hit enter and then close it. That makes it a lot easier to view, and now we have 100-degree increments. So I'm going to come down, and I'm going to do Alt-W to make this full screen so I can zoom in. I have both planes at reference selected. I'm just going to center this at 0. There we go. Now if I take both these, I can freeze them both, and now I won't accidentally click on them while I'm modeling. So the first step is we're going to go in with a little bit of lathe. So I'm going to come up here to Create and Shapes. So there's a couple different ways we can handle creating our table here. Let's start with the pedestal. That'll be the easiest one to do. I'm going to go ahead and just start drawing out a line for it. And because we're primarily making things for games, I'm not going to deal too much with curves. I'm going to try and get the general shape going. I might make it a little bit angular at points instead of having the curves so that I'm not completely blowing my polygon budget. Notice I'm not being absolutely perfect. If I make mistakes, I'm just moving on. I'm holding the middle mouse button to zoom, to pan the camera or canvas around. And really, when you're building splines like this, it can be a little stressful until you realize you're really just putting down basic points. You're going to go back in and refine and change those points later on. So I'll just keep busting out all these different points. Here we go. We got our basic shape. So I'm going to end it right there, right click, and that's done. Now, it's not perfect. Doesn't have to be. We can make it better though. So I'm here to modify. I'm in a vertex. I'm going to select all my vertex points, and I'm just going to right click on any one of them. And over here in Tools 1, I want to change the type. I'm going to make all these corners. There we go. And so now I'm just going to go in and kind of refine the shape to make it match the outline of this pedestal better. There we go. I'm just clicking and moving the points around. You can always go in if you feel you need to add an extra point. You could always use the refine button to go in and add an extra point somewhere if you think it needs it. You just click on refine, see how the cursor changes. You click, right click to get out of refine, and then you can move the point. Oh, let's move this guy down a little bit. So instead of just having a curve, I defined a series of points there for it. All right, that's good. I'm now going to come over to the modify. I'm going to go into my modifier list, and I want to come down and select lathe. So lathe is going to take what we have, and it's going to create geometry out of it based off of an axis. If I go into the axis here, you can see I can move it, and it starts to create my shape. So if I move it over, and I'm moving it only in the front view, if I start moving it in other views like the top or in perspective, I may see how the lines start to twist around, and we don't want that. So you make sure to move it only along the X-plane here. So define the base of it. I think that's looking pretty good. Anytime you're working with splines, you want to go to Display, and in Display Properties, turn on Backface Cull. That will show you whether or not your geometry is inside out, and this one is. So I need to come over here to the Modify panel and click on Flip Normals. So now they're facing the proper direction. Alright, so the pedestal is done. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to my next step. The next step is just to make the top of the table. And so for this, I'm going to do it a little bit differently, slightly different technique. I'm going to go ahead and make a circle. So I'm going to click here in the center and just drag out the circle until I get to the edge of the table. And I'm going to rotate it. I'm going to click and drag that up, rotate this 180 or 90 degrees. Negative 90 actually, if you could see it up there. Now over on the side, I'm going to come over and I'm going to draw out another shape. Same thing I did before. I'm just clicking to create this basic shape. And I'm just clicking to get these points in place. Alright, and now I'm going to take this over, and I don't want to have the table be totally solid. So I'm just going to click once here to give it thickness, then bring one point up. And then right click to end my shapes. Now I select my tabletop. And if I go to modify, I'm going to use a different modifier. This one is called Bevel Profile. Here I can pick my profile. That would be the secondary shape that I just drew out. In later versions, you have to click Classic and then pick Profile. And now my table has a tabletop. And if we look, we can see if that matches the reference. It does. If it didn't match the reference, sometimes you have to go into the Profile Gizmo, which is the sub-object. If I orbit underneath, you could kind of see it here in wireframe. You can adjust kind of the shape. This tabletop is a relatively simple shape. There we go. So now we've used lathe and bevel profile.